So, just to kind of burst into the chapter out of the gate, this chapter is completely and totally about purity and avoiding temptation and fornication. And so, we will have 10 points, though I don't want to seem deceiving. There is like a coup de grace. There's like a final point that's not really a point. So it really, for the sake of being completely forthright, there are 11 points, but there are 10 points. This is from Wild at Heart. He has this to say in one of the passages. He says, "The phone just rang. A friend called to tell me that yet another Christian leader has fallen into sexual immorality. The church wags its head and says, 'You see, he just couldn't keep himself clean.' That is so naive. Do you think that a man, a follower after Christ, in his heart of hearts really wanted to fall? What man begins his journey wishing, 'I think one day after 20 years of ministry, I'll torpedo the whole thing with an affair'? He was picked off. The whole thing was plotted. In this case, it was a long and subtle assignment to wear his defenses down, not so much through battle as through boredom. I knew that man. He had no great cause to fight for, just the monotony of professional Christian ministry that he hated but couldn't get out of because he was being so well paid for it. He was set up for a fall. Unless you are aware that that's what it is, you'll be taken out too. Notice this. When did King David fall? What were the circumstances of his affair with Bathsheba? In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. David was no longer a warrior. He sent others to do his fighting for him. Bored, sated, and fat, he strolls around on the roof of the palace looking for something to amuse him. The evil one points out Bathsheba, and the rest is history." So I start with that because actually this passage, as with a lot of Proverbs, it deals with a very narrow perspective on it. It's really, this passage gives almost no reference whatsoever to the enemy. And so I just wanted to start with this reference to the enemy because we understand that one of his greatest tools in his arsenal against us is temptation. And so I think it's important at the outset here as we begin to consider this that we consider this in its full biblical light, and that is that this is by far one of the enemy's greatest weapons against us. "My son," verse 1, "pay attention to my wisdom, lend your ear to my understanding, that you may preserve discretion, and that your lips may keep knowledge." Our first point tonight, we have 10 points to purity. Our first point tonight is discretion. Discretion. This is not going to be a junior high perspective on purity. I'm not going to list all of the STDs for you guys. I'm not going to tell you, girls, that you could get pregnant. I think you've probably thought that through by now. I'm not going to so much focus on the consequences, though this passage does deal with the consequences. This is, again, going to be a Proverbs look at it, and it's actually a very intriguing look. It's not the whole picture, as I already mentioned. It's really not the whole picture on how to maintain purity. But it is a very good picture, and there are a lot of very valuable things in it. Discretion. About 2 or 3 weeks ago, and Alicia and I were in Melbourne. I can't recall the exact reason, but she was running in a random Publix near the hospital. I think we were down there for the hospital for some reason or another, and she was getting flowers at the Publix, and for some reason or another, she was dressed very nicely, and she had high heels on, something that she almost never wears. She almost never wears heels. And I was sitting in the car, and she ran into the Publix there, and she came back out with a really odd look on her face about 5 minutes later, and she was like, "I literally just got hit on 4 times in like 5 minutes." And she was obviously disgusted and just like, what in the world? And don't worry, ladies, I'm not a legalist. I'm not going to tell you not to wear high heels. But my point is this. If you live a discreet life, fornication and the temptation towards that direction is far, far less frequent and far less, the temptation towards it is far less of an issue. And I really mean this. And I'm not just talking to the girls, though we know that Peter tells wives to be discreet. But let's not forget that here in this passage, he's talking to his son. And we already know that Proverbs has a lot to say about discretion. But I'm just here to tell you guys that first and foremost, with purity, this is a really simple thing that is incredibly overlooked in our culture, and particularly in our county, being that we live in like the Sun Belt, and we live on the beach, and so people walk around in their bathing suits, and there's people going to 7-Elevens with their shirts off, and guys in flip-flops and everything, and so it's not really quite like that when you go to Kentucky in the summertime, unless you're like by a big pool or a big pond where everybody goes swimming. Not quite the same scenario. And obviously there are relativities involved in any form of this discretion. But I want to tell you guys that there really is something to the truth, guys and girls, that if you live with discretion, if you live discreetly, particularly, it's not going to really make a difference as far as like pornography and the temptation towards pornography, but as far as the temptation towards fornication and the availability of it and the in-your-faceness of it, it will be drastically less. I'm just saying, it is like Alicia. I mean, she's beautiful, but she doesn't get hit on that much, and like it was incredible, literally within like 5 minutes, and we had this conversation. She actually brought it up about the heels, and it's like, so we made a decision that she's never going to wear high heels again. No, no, that's not the decision we made. But no, I'm in trouble. There's a course in teaching where he used his wife as an illustration, and he didn't ask her, and he's like laughing at his joke, and then he looks at her in the audience, and he's like, oh. I might be in trouble. He's like, I am in trouble. He's like, oh.
She just is in trouble.
I'm always in trouble. That's like the Avengers thing where with the Hulk, where he's like, you ask me how I am because I'm mad. Oh, I'm always mad. Anyways, I'm not always in trouble. Honestly, though, discretion, I'm telling you, guys, if you live with discretion, there are very subtle things in the way that you act and the way that you dress. Girls, there are very subtle things in the way that you act and you dress. And to be quite honestly, it makes purity a lot simpler. You have an enemy that's out to destroy you in any way that he can, through temptation or whatever. And if there are little things that you can do in your life that can make it buffer yourself just a little bit more from those onslaughts and unnecessary interest from people of the opposite sex, why not? Why not embrace those things to some degree? Now, I am not preaching legalism. I'm not saying don't wear high heels. I'm just saying that there really is a truth to this. We know that in the New Testament it tells wives in particular to be discreet, and here in this context he's obviously speaking to a young man, and interestingly enough, that is something you almost never hear nowadays. You'd never, I don't know that I've ever heard it taught or I've ever taught it, to tell young men to be discreet, to be more discreet, than the way that they're living. I was in youth ministry for a very long time, and when you hear someone's sob story of their downfall, it's very interesting to me how often it starts with something very simple, with a look or a comment that somebody made in a place, like somewhere they were at, someone just showed interest, and before they knew it, a relationship had developed, and then it became sexual, and there was this downfall, and you're just like, what? And when you go back to the beginning of it and you look at it, there was something that they could have avoided the whole thing by maybe being a little more discreet, or by maybe doing another point that we're going to look at later. And so I think there's a lot of value in this idea of just being discreet. And that your lips may keep knowledge. Verse 3. For the lips of an immoral woman drip honey, and her mouth is smoother than oil. Her mouth is smoother than oil. So, I'm going to give you guys a key. We generally try and keep this truth bottled up until people are getting married, and so Josh and Sydney will obviously be very aware of what I'm about to tell you. Because in the hands of a wicked person, I'm giving you, girls, the key to manipulating men, getting whatever you want from a man. And let me give you a hint. It has pretty much nothing to do with how you dress or what you look like. There is an incredible age-old truth in this verse that has just surpassed the eons and is only now really being acknowledged and recognized by secular psychology, and it is being recognized by secular psychology. There has been a massive paradigm shift, even in secular psychology in the last 5 to 10 years, in this understanding that women's primary need in marriage is love, and men's primary need is not love, it's respect. And we see it in the Bible. The Bible is so clear on this issue. It's why in Ephesians it says that women are they're to respect their husbands, they're to honor their husbands, they're to submit to their husbands, and the husbands are to love their wives. Interesting that the Bible made this distinction eons ago, this distinction that the husband, God says to the husband, love your wife. Why? Because it's her chief need. And then he says to the wife, submit to your husband. Why? Because that is the ultimate expression of respect, of believing. You guys, I know it's a hokey song, and it was popular for a very short time, but that cheerleader song, you guys know what song I'm talking about, right? Like, that song is very, very interesting. Very interesting. Girls, what's his main draw to the woman of his dreams that he's faithful to in that song? That she's his cheerleader, that she's his largest cheerleader, and she's always there for him. It's not her body. He does make the obligatory comment that she's beautiful and that she's hot, but that's really not the point. Even in the song, that's conveyed because he has hot women coming up to him and asking him to have sex with him all the time. And so it's really not the point. There's no mention in the song that she's hotter than the girls that are hitting on him. The thing that keeps him faithful to her is that she is his biggest cheerleader and that she's always there for him. I'm telling you guys, this is an age-old truth, and once you're aware of it, it is incredible. It is absolutely incredible to realize that men, we have such small, fragile egos, and we need, and I'm not saying that, I'm not like totally trying to use that as like a biblical truth, the idea of our egos and all that, but we need and we crave respect from the women in our lives. That's why it says that this woman here, this woman who finds her way into the arms of many, many different men, her pathway, you'll notice in this chapter, it says very little about what she looks like. It says very, very little about what she looks like. And throughout Proverbs, you'll note that the adulterous woman, it says a lot about what she says. And this is a truth. In the hands of an evil woman, it will allow you to become the ultimate manipulator, to essentially get what you want, whatever you want from men. If you can build a man up, if you can be his cheerleader, if you can, your lips drip with honey as you talk to him, you are incredible. You would be great at whatever you do. Man, I'll tell you what, that is actually the way to a man's heart. Now, that being said, I was thinking about this, and I was pondering this truth. That's not a new truth. I don't think it's new to even many of you. I'm certain I've touched on it before and kind of talked about it a little bit. It's really not the point of what we're talking about tonight, so I don't have much more to say about that. But I was thinking about how does a man overcome this sort of temptation? How does he overcome a woman who is attracted to him and is constantly building him up and just like, you're awesome, you're amazing. How does he overcome that? And my mind drifted back to Joseph. And so if you want to turn there briefly, let's just look at Genesis 39. We're going to look at the passage where Potiphar's wife, his master's wife, cast longing eyes on him. And we're going to hopefully glean something really valuable from this passage. So just for those of you taking notes, this second point is dearly beloved. Dearly beloved. beloved. Genesis 39. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. Then he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had he put in his hand. So it was from the time that he had made him overseer of his house and all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he did not know what he had except for the bread which he ate. And Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. Now it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph, and she said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he has into my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" How can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Now Joseph, as a foundation, obviously had some really good teaching as a kid. He apparently, his dad, I don't know if you've ever thought about the dynamics of this story, that he had been a slave, he had been in really terrible situations, and he retained the faith of his father from his childhood through all kinds of incredibly horrible situations, to be practically killed by his brothers and then sold into slavery, taken to a foreign land and then sold as a slave, and to have God begin to bless you, and then to have this raunchy woman start to make advances at you, and then to ruin everything that was happening. Joseph had every reason to fall. Every reason. I think that there's practically no chance that you guys are not aware of the fact that whenever the devil's about to tempt you, he usually tries to discourage you first. Because if he can discourage you first, or if he can get you down, or get you questioning God's decision-making in your life, then the temptation will almost always take root. It's the exact same thing he did with Eve. He didn't begin with the temptation. He began with a discouragement. He began with a question. He began first by questioning essentially God's love and God's wisdom for Eve and for Adam. And I'm telling you, temptation almost always comes as a 1-2 punch. It almost always comes with a discouragement, with a frustration, with a heartbreak, with something, and then we all go, "Oh yeah, you know what? I'm just gonna give into this temptation, because you know what? I'm discouraged and God's not there for me." And so for some reason in our minds, it lends some sort of legitimacy to our fall or our downfall that is pending. But to tie this in now, I want to kind of lean back on something that was said in Wild at Heart, where he said there, notice that he was actually making the point that David's downfall was because David had come to this place where he was no longer a warrior, where he was no longer engaged in the Lord, and he was no longer actively involved with the Lord and with the Lord's ministry. And interestingly enough, as you start to look at this, and I was considering this, and you look particularly at Joseph and the factors that I believe led him to be able to resist this temptation, and I think there are 3 aspects of the same factor, and that is this, that Joseph was dearly beloved by God, that he was dearly beloved by God. And I really mean this. I really mean this truth. If you are walking in close proximity with the Lord and enjoying his presence, and you are seeing that, and I don't mean this in a disrespectful way, that he is like a cheerleader. He is like, go for it. I am for you. I believe in you, and I really want you to succeed. And in a respectful way, that he is your biggest cheerleader. He is your biggest fan. I really mean that. His thoughts towards you are more than the sands on the seashore, and they are good, and they are thoughts to give you a future and a hope, and to work the things in your life, the bright things and the dark things, to weave them together into a tapestry of your life, and to bring about a good outcome in your life, that he is for you, that he is your largest cheerleader. I see there in Genesis 39, proximity, the Lord was with Joseph. God's presence. I think I already read this. Oh no, there's another part I want to read here. This is what he says on the next page in Wild at Heart. The discipline, by the way, is never the point. He's talking about having a devotional life here. He says the discipline, by the way, is never the point. The whole point of a devotional life is connecting with God. This is our primary antidote to the counterfeits the world holds out to us. If you do not have God and have him deeply, you will turn to other lovers. As Maurice Roberts says, ecstasy and delight are essential to the believer's soul, and they promote sanctification. We are not meant to live without spiritual exhilaration. The believer is in spiritual danger if he allows himself to go for any length of time without tasting the love of Christ. When Christ ceases to fill the heart with satisfaction, our souls will go in silent search of other lovers. The believer is in spiritual danger if he allows himself to go for any length of time without tasting the love of Christ. Dearly beloved, this idea here that I'm trying to drive home and wrap my head around as I'm teaching it, this incredible concept that probably the greatest inhibitor in the life of a believer to temptation is proximity to Jesus, to tasting on a regular basis of his love for you. Here in chapter 39, I see proximity there in verse 2, that God, his presence was with Joseph. And he makes a really good point in this chapter that I'm reading from, that too many Christians are satisfied without experiencing God on a regular basis and his love for you on a regular basis. I think about when we went and saw Francis Chan like 8 or 10 years ago at a conference locally, and he had at least one of his kids with him, and in the final session as he was preaching, his little, she was like 3 or 4 years old, his daughter ran out on the stage and like jumped him, and so he like picked her up and held her like this, and she just buried her head in his shoulder, and he just kept preaching, and he was like, sorry, I don't know if it was a stunt. Knowing him, it could have been a stunt because he likes visual, like, I don't know if you ever watch him, but he really likes visual stuff. But like, he's like, sorry, here she is, and he's like, and then he started talking about prayer, and he essentially said to everybody, is this what your prayer life looks like? And I'll never forget that, because he taught for like the next 15 or 20 minutes, and she was just like clinging to him, and her head was like buried in his shoulder, and he began talking about prayer, and then he ended it by saying, is this what your prayer life looks like? And you can be like, oh, well, I'm not so sure that's really biblical, you know. I think back, I was thinking about this whole thing this week, and I was kind of meditating on it. I think back to when Jesus was on the hill overlooking Jerusalem in the Passion Week, and he was weeping over Jerusalem, and he said, oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those I sent to you, the deity of Christ. That passage is incredible. I'm going to try and not get off any rabbit trails because there are like really big theological things. And how the one who kills the prophets and stones those I sent to you. How often I wanted to gather you as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. I believe the heart of God has not changed. I believe that he would say that still today to many of us, to hearts in here, that he would say to you, that he would, I'm not going to say anybody's name, but he would say, Chris, how long have you been resisting the things that I want to do in your life? They may not be overtly pleasant at first. How long have you been resisting my hand in your life? How often I've wanted to gather you as a hen gathers her chicks under her wing, but you weren't willing. There's an incredible truth in that. That God, I see in that an overarching theme of our lives, that God is constantly wanting to draw you under his wing, to pick you up and to hold you like Francis Chan was holding his daughter that day. And that, by and large, I believe it's meant to be our experience, our daily experience. As a hen gathers her chicks under her wing, the tenderness of that, it's very feminine. It's an incredible thing. It's one of those truths where God is, quite frankly, both masculine and feminine. He has that incredible tenderness, but he also has that incredible strength, too. The things that were in Adam, both of them, the masculinity and the femininity, before he was split and divided in two, and God decided to put most or all of the masculinity in one and the femininity in another, but they exist in God as one, incredibly enough. But that idea there that he wants to gather us as a hen gathers her chicks under her wing, but we are not willing so often. Story of our lives, story of my life, at least for a long time, long periods of time. I'm just too preoccupied, or I'm too upset about what he's doing or not doing in my life, and there's this subtle, unspoken unwillingness to let him just cradle me like a child, which is, by and large, I believe, supposed to be our experience as believers. But God was with Joseph. I believe it's more than just a statement of favor. I believe that it's a reality that Joseph lived with, the proximity of God's presence, living under the shadow of his wing. And as he holds, Isaiah, I believe it's chapter 41, says he leads the gentle ones as a shepherd, and he carries them close to his heart and his bosom. That is to be our experience. And why am I harping on this? I'm harping on this because as I've been meditating on this passage this week, I believe this is actually the fundamental issue here. Dearly beloved, if you are allowing yourself to be the dearly beloved, to be beloved, to walk in his presence, in the proximity of his presence, temptations lose their ability to gain a foothold in your heart. They lose that ability. Because you understand there's a greater love there, and you understand that you are valuable to him and that he loves you. And when somebody else comes along and says, hey, stud, you're strong, or you'd be good at this, and you're like, I know, God thinks so too. Goodbye. No, and I don't mean that in a prideful way. I mean it in a reality, though, that if you are confident in his love for you, when other people come in and they start to pour on flattery, I really want to quote Wreck-It Ralph right now. I'm not going to. You can just be like, flattery don't charge these batteries, sailor, And there's really a truth to that. Flattery requires in the person that it's aimed at, it requires insecurity. It requires brokenness. It requires the person dying for affection. And if you're following me on this, there is a truth. There are a lot of believers that are real believers, real Christians, been walking with the Lord for a long time, and yet there is this deep brokenness in them because they are not drinking deeply of the fountain of living waters, and they are not letting him carry them in his bosom under the shadow of his wings. And so there is this deep, broken insecurity in them, and they walk around, and you hear it on Christian radio because every other song is like, you're loved, you're great, you're powerful, because we're like trying to tell all these Christians who are broken and not tasting of God's love for themselves that they're valuable. But it's not something that's so much intellectually stated or apprehended. It's something that is conveyed by being in his presence. You feel your value to him. You feel how important you are to him and your usefulness to him. And so when someone comes along and says those things, they don't take root in your heart because you're not one of those people that's walking around broken going, I wish somebody would love me. And I know Christians like that. I know Christians, you see them on Facebook, like every other post, you just see it in the things they say and the pictures they take. They're like dying. And obviously it's out in the world, but I'm talking about Christians. They're like dying for somebody to love them. If that's you, you are going to be easy prey one day. If you have not found the depths of how much God loves you and how important you are to him, you will be prey to temptation one day, because some man or woman is going to walk up to you and say, you're great, you're amazing, you're beautiful, you would be good at this. And for some of you, if you're like embracing every heartache in your life and the brokenness, you're going to be like, wow, it's been years since I've heard that from anybody. And God's going to be like, are you serious? How often I've wanted to gather you as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing. How often I have been whispering that to you and you were not listening. Proximity there in verse 2. Favor, another part of God's love. So Joseph found favor in his sight. This is God's favor. This reminds me of when, after David fell and Nathan confronted him, what was the thing that Nathan said? This idea here that God was favoring Joseph. Remember, it's one of the most heartbreaking things that's ever been said in Scripture. What did Nathan say to him, speaking on God's behalf?
That he gave you all these things and he would have given you more.
I would have given you more. If it wasn't enough, I would have given you more. Interesting truth there, because that's from Yahweh, right? So there's an interesting kind of condescension there to the reality that favor is a buffer against temptation. Do you see that truth embedded in that statement? That if all of these things I have already given you weren't enough, I would have given you more. I would have given you more. And that there is a truth. It's not the absolute buffer to temptation. It's definitely not the absolute buffer to temptation. I believe that's God's proximity and his presence. But a secondary buffer against temptation is finding yourself in God's favor. Again, there are many, many, many Christians that they would probably look at their life if I went around the room and you were honest and we were alone and I said, are you experiencing God's favor in your life? Probably get varied answers. Some of you would be like, dude, in every area of my life right now, I'm experiencing God's favor. It's amazing. But for some of you, you might be like, dude, I don't even know what that looks like. I've never known what that looks like. And I'm here to tell you that he wants to give you favor. But the doorway into his favor is actually sacrifice. It's actually sacrifice. The doorway into his favor is actually sacrifice. It's an idea that's alluded to in the Mount Moriah passage where let me look at the passage because there's something I want to say. I need to read one of the verses. You know, I'm probably not going to be able to find it in this Bible. It's in the verse where God has told Abraham to go up on the mountain and sacrifice Isaac. And he says, there in verse 12, and he said, do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Right? So he's sacrificed him figuratively. Thankfully, not literally. God didn't require the human sacrifice. It was a test. But go down to verse 17. This is where he finds that God is Jehovah Jireh, or Yahweh Yireh. God is the provision, is his name there. But in verse 17, he says here, in blessing I will bless you, and in multiplying I will multiply your descendants as the stars of the heaven. And he goes on. Blessing and multiplication are given to the person who has laid the chief love of their life on the altar. And so I say to you guys, this idea of walking in God's favor, if you find yourself tonight saying, you know what, I don't even know what that looks like, it's very possible that the reason you don't know what it looks like is because there is a love in your life, probably a good love, a godly a person, a spouse, a brother, a sister, a parent, a friend, a thing, something that there's nothing inherently wrong with. Isaac was the fulfillment of a promise, but he was a love that was greater, apparently, possibly, than Abraham's love for God. And so God had him lay him on the altar, and when he laid him on the altar, he found that sacrifice was the doorway into God's favor. And I don't mean this to be taken as some sort of thing where you can take it like the name it, claim it people, where we make God just a means to an end, where I'm going to sacrifice to get into favor so I have a nicer, easier life. That's really not the point. But it is a truth. It is a biblical truth that the doorway into God's favor is by letting go of the thing that you love more than God. And there are very good logical reasons, but that's not the point of the teaching tonight, why he does that. So firstly, their proximity in verse 2, Genesis 39, verse 2, favor in verse 4, Joseph found favor in his sight. And then in verse 9, there was no one greater in this house than I. Now, think about this concept here in light of what I'd already said about men's need for significance, for respect. This idea here that Joseph, because he walked closely with God and he loved God and he was in that proximity with God, and also because he had found favor with God, because he held nothing back from God, because he was there, he actually knew what it meant, what it looked like to have God actively involved in his life in a major way. And he found a life of significance. Now, this appeals, quite frankly, more to men than it does to women, but it does appeal to both of us, this idea of significance in your life. And I tell you the truth, I believe these three factors are a major part, a major reason that Joseph was able to withstand the temptation. He is a paradigm that so many of us just we look at, and quite frankly, there have been seasons in my life that when I think about Joseph, I just get discouraged because I have an easier time than he did, and I still find myself giving in to temptation and seasons, and I just look at him like, how this guy, I don't know about, maybe this appeals more to the guys, but sometimes he's like the curve breaker. You know, everybody else in your class gets like a 45, and then that one dude that gets a 99 on the test, the teacher goes, sorry, can't curve it. You know, I can't make the highest grade. Okay, y'all get 1 point. You know, I'll make the highest grade 100 and give everybody else the same ratio. All right, your 45 is a 46, you know. I hated those people, you know, because I was never the curve breaker. I was always right in the middle of the pack. Joseph is the ultimate curve breaker because in the test where everybody else gets a 45, the dude scored 150. You know, he didn't just get 100 points. He did 50 points of extra credit, too. It's absolutely ridiculous, actually, quite frankly. I love this guy. But the point is, I really believe these three factors had a major part in it. Had a major, major part in it. He was walking closely with God. He was walking in God's favor. And he had, because he was walking in God's favor, found a life of significance. This is something that actually we long for, and it's really revealed in the popularity of that book, The Purpose-Driven Life. Like how many people are like, I want more purpose in my life. I want more purpose in my life. Can I tell you, the pathway to finding more purpose in your life is not you going out and beating the bushes and starting a ministry or doing whatever it is. It's getting close with God, finding that place under the shadow of his wings. It's letting go of the love or loves that you have in your life that are greater than him, and then consistently walking in that, and you will find favor growing in your life, and you over time, one day will find yourself going, dude, I have a really great life. Look at the significance of the life that I have. God is doing great things in my life. And to the person, it's not that these people never fall. I think of people that I think of even Calvary people that have fallen, they did have greatness in their life. You know, they had seen God's favor in their life, and at points in their life, they had walked closely with God. I think of a pastor in particular that at one point he had the third or fourth largest church in the nation. Greatness. And I don't mean this in a worldly way. Like God had given this guy favor. This guy who early in his ministry, I used to love to listen to him, and something that he popularized early in his ministry was having date nights with Jesus. Even though he was married and he had kids, he was like, I love going on date nights with Jesus. And he would go out and he'd go out for the evening and just go be alone with the Lord. And this guy fell. And so I'm not saying it's impossible to fall from this place, but I am saying that these factors are incredible buffers against temptation. And I see them at work in Joseph's life as he is tasting deeply of that fountain of living water, of that fountain of being dearly beloved. When you know, not just beyond a mental assent, beyond a mental apprehension, but when you know in the very core of who you are because of the closeness of your proximity, feeling God's presence today, feeling God's favor this week, in the greatness, the significance of the life that he's given you, that's a hard place to fall from. It's not impossible, but it's a hard place. It's a place where it is very, very difficult for the temptations to take root. So, our first point there in Proverbs chapter 5 was discretion. 10 keys to purity. Our first point was discretion. The second one is dearly beloved, being dearly beloved, walking in that, walking in awareness and in a proximity of God's love for you. Verse 4, but in the end she is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Third point, destiny. The third key to purity is destiny. Destiny. It is good for you to consider the destiny of a certain path. It is good to stop when you're being tempted, when there is this offer before you. It is good to consider the destiny of that choice. It's good to consider it. And in particular, I want you to notice something very interesting about this verse. It doesn't say the end is bitter as wormwood. It says in the end, she is as bitter as wormwood. And there is an incredible truth here. And I've seen it. I've seen marriages dissolve. I've seen marriages dissolve where it was the man's fault, and I've seen marriages dissolve where it was the woman's fault. And in particular, as Proverbs says, there is a woman that tears her own house down, who in the end, she is bitter as wormwood. And can I tell you, there's a fundamental, there might be many reasons, but from my observation, there is one reason this happens. It happens in the woman who has made herself an object. It happens in the woman who takes this approach to men. Whether she takes this approach to her own husband or to all men in general, she takes the sexual approach. She takes the modern approach. She takes the Sex in the City approach, where women, go out and just be sexual, sleep around, have a good time, do whatever you want. You'll find happiness there. No, you won't. Because you know what you're looking for? You're looking for love. You're looking for love. And I need to say this in a different way. There's a video series that we watch with the young men and women that we do premarital counseling with, and it's from a guy named Mark Gungor. And I'm sorry, this is a graphic passage, and I'm going to be slightly graphic for a moment. And he literally says to the ladies, he says, the truth is that the key to your husband's heart is through his sex life, and it actually is true. And then he says to the man, he says the key to sex with your wife is her heart. And it puts the two at this interesting stalemate, where if he's wise and he wants to have sex with his wife, he's going to be loving to her. And if she's wise, if she wants love from him, then she's going to give herself to him. And as this thing works, the way it's meant to work, it builds love and it builds strength. He said, but the interesting thing is that many wives, even Christian wives, they find themselves giving themselves to their husband or to men, hoping to get love from them, and they never get it. They never get it. He said, this is the ultimate fallacy to the single woman who keeps sleeping around and hoping that she'll find love, that she'll receive love in response. And quite frankly, it never happens. It's the basis of a lot of modern rom-coms, the whole idea of he's not that into you. I've never seen the movie, but just to give like an idea here, the reason that a lot of men are not that into women nowadays is because they don't need to. They don't have to buy the house to stay there once in a while. Women are giving it away for free. And the really sad thing, and if you're following me on this, am I making sense? The really sad thing about this is that these women find themselves bitter because you're not getting the thing that you really desire. You're not getting real commitment from a man. You're not getting real love from a man. And this is why women need to have commitment beforehand. They must insist on it. You don't give yourself away. You don't give your body away, because you will never get love that way. And the interesting thing about this immoral woman, the mark of her life is that she's like a modern woman. She's like Sex in the City. She's sleeping around, and she is self-defeating. She is destroying herself and her own life, and she finds herself too late to change, that she is nothing but bitterness. And the only person she has to blame is herself. You, ladies, I'm telling you the truth. If you take this route thinking that you'll find love, you are sorely mistaken, and you will find yourself bitter as wormwood in the end. Guys, I tell you the truth, if you take this route with women, and you take we're not going to have any commitments, and we'll just sleep together, it doesn't matter how much you love that woman now. In the end, she will be bitter as wormwood, and she will hate you. She will hate you, and you will hate each other. Doesn't matter if you're Christians, doesn't matter if you get married. If it's simply this sexual thing where only the guys need this, He's been giving sex without any commitment, without any love being given. The woman will find herself bitter as wormwood. It's very good to consider your destiny. It's very good to consider the destiny of choices with temptation. Verse 5, her feet go down to death, her steps lay hold of hell. The interesting thing, so our fourth point here is death. The interesting thing, the sad thing is that fornication, and I mean in particular what he's talking about here is sex outside of marriage or sex while you're married with someone else other than your spouse. It always brings death. Maybe physical death, maybe not, but it brings death to other things. It brings death. Death begins to reign in your life. Death of jobs, death of finances, death of relationships, death of enjoyment of simple things in life, death of relationships with children, brokenness. Death begins to reign in the life as a whole. Death begins to reign in all kinds of forms in the life of the person that give themselves over to fornication. And it's important to make a note here that John Corson made in Genesis chapter 2 and 3 about the temptation. There are many people, and there might be someone in here tonight, God forbid, there might be somebody in here that you actually are in the midst of temptation. There is literally somebody in your life that is pursuing you, and you are thinking about it. You're actually thinking about going that way, or maybe someday this might happen, and you are taking the place of the rugged American individualist, and you're like, well, I know that there will be consequences to my decisions and sleeping with so-and-so or whatever, but you know what? I'm just going to tough it up, and I'm going to face those consequences because she's worth it or he's worth it. And I've thought it through, and I know the consequences. And the world's not even, they're not dumb. They readily accept the fact that there are consequences to the way that they live. Can I tell you this truth from Genesis 2 and 3, that you may have thought through the consequences, you may find them acceptable, whatever consequences, whatever amount of death that you see or that you're aware of. The truth from Genesis chapter 2 and chapter 3 is that the consequences will be far worse than you ever imagined. They will be farther reaching than you ever could have perceived. Yeah, they knew, Eve knew, that in the day that she ate of the fruit, that she would die. Little did she know, at least it seems apparent from the passage, that it would spread death to all mankind when Adam ate. And that because she would eat of the tree, and Adam would eat of the tree, that not only would each of them die individually, but every single one of their children would also die, would face death. It would bring death not only to her and her immediate family, but it would bring death to the entire world. Animals would now die. Animals would now kill each other. Animals would now eat each other. People would be eaten by animals one day. Not only that, it would reign in a much more heartbreaking way. Death would reign in her personal family as her firstborn would murder her secondborn son. I tell you the truth. I completely agree with John Corson on this. He said, you may have thought it through. You may have considered the consequences of this particular temptation, but I tell you the truth. He's like, I've been a pastor for a very long time, and I've talked over and over and over and over and over and over again with people that are weeping. One day you will weep, and you will say, if only I had known how bad the consequences will really be, I wouldn't have gone that way. I tell you the truth, guys. The death that reigns, particularly with sexual sin, is far more pervasive than you imagine. It will go further. It will touch lives you never imagined. And when you're considering it, notice that the dynamic there with Eve is that she's like, all right, I'll face death personally. That's not the hard part. The hard part isn't when the consequences of your decisions affect you. The hard part is when they break someone close to you. The hard part, the truly heartbreaking part, is when that death touches somebody else in your life that you actually really love, maybe as much as you love yourself. And we figure the consequences out, and we go, I can handle this consequence. And the thing that will really break you later on is when that death that you've brought in through sin always produces death. It always brings death, still to this day. You're going to die, but the sins that we do, particularly sexual sin, It brings death, and it's always more far-reaching and pervasive than you ever could have imagined, and it will break people. It will break people that you love and relationships and things that you love. Verse 6. Wow, we are making really good time. Lest you ponder her path of life, her ways are unstable, you do not know them. Therefore hear me now, my children, and do not depart from the words of my mouth. Decide. Our fifth point here in verse 6 is decide. Decide now not to ponder her path. Notice, again, referring back to the garden, that the devil's first attack, it wasn't a temptation. And I already kind of bled into this idea that it's a 1-2 punch. But his first attack was an attempt to get her to ponder. That's all it was. It was an attempt to get her to ponder something that she shouldn't be pondering. The tree, the fruit. Is God really loving? Does he actually have my best interest at heart? He was attempting to get her to ponder first. Again, this idea of a 1-2 punch with temptation. Decide now. Make a decision now. We have the ability as spiritual beings to set our face as a flint, to make decisions, and by God's grace, to stick to those decisions. And we cannot face life knowing that temptations will come against us without having any framework within us to face it. And part of the framework that you have to set up now in your life is you must make a confession in your own heart that I am not going to ponder the path that goes down this street, that goes to this woman. I'm not going to ponder it. I'm not going to think about the temptation. We tend to view, particularly, and this is kind of at men, we tend to view temptation as purely visual. It's just like something, oh, a temptation popped up, oh, it's visual. No, temptation generally, spiritually speaking, but because it's an attack, it generally relies upon getting your interest and getting you to begin to think. And where I'm going with this is, I don't know about you guys, but if you are listening to, and I'm not going to tell you don't listen to secular music, and I'm not going to tell you don't watch TV, though if you're wise, you probably won't. Manipulation. Sort of kidding. I don't know about you guys, but I drive a lot in my car, and sometimes I get really tired of the Christian radio and all of my playlist, and so I'll play secular music sometimes in my car, just honestly, partly just to kind of see where the world is at, because music is a very interesting indicator of where culture is at. I don't remember who the person was, but Ravi Zacharias always quotes this one quote that is absolutely true. From a great philosopher, and he said, I don't care who writes the laws of a country, let me write the music. You let me write the music of a country, and it doesn't matter who writes the laws. It's a heavy statement. It's a crazy statement. And so there's a part of me that once in a while I'm scanning the secular radio stations and I'm listening to secular music, and I'm just thinking about like the paradigms at work and what people are thinking. But you know what also happens, though, when I'm doing that, just to be completely honest with you? Once in a while you happen across these songs, love songs or whatever, and all of a sudden you find yourself pondering a path you shouldn't be pondering. Pondering a breakup song, pondering a bar hopping song, pondering a one-night stand song. And you go, dude, whoa, where did this train of thought come? Where did this fugitive impulse come? TV is incredibly worse. I'm just going to tell you guys, I'm not going to tell you what to do with your lives, except I will tell you this. Alicia and I don't have cable. We don't have Netflix. We don't have any of that. We have a collection of DVDs, and we had Apple TV before one of our children did something destructive and terminal with the remote. I don't know. We don't know where it is. The Apple TV remote disappeared like 6 months ago, and I'm pretty certain it either got flushed down the toilet or it got put in the trash can. But yeah, actually, it's probably Kylie. Josh hasn't put anything in the. Josh never puts anything in the trash can. Kylie puts things in the trash can, though. But I really tell you guys the truth. I can't even so Alicia and I, the only time we ever watch TV is like at our parents' house. Like when I go to my mom's house, I DVR a bunch of fishing shows on her TV, and we'll usually like watch debates or something like that at Alicia's parents' house. But I tell you guys the truth, it blows my mind. Maybe because we don't watch TV, like we do not watch TV. Maybe it blows my mind that once every 2 or 3 weeks when we're over there and we like have a Sunday afternoon, we just like plop down in front of the TV. I'm like, good Lord, like it is horrible. Like the things that are going on in TV, and this is old hat. You guys know this. I'm old enough to, I don't know how many teachings I've heard over the years as a Christian about this sort of thing. But you know what? I think we as Christians have shied away about talking about this because of the link to legalism, and because, you know, it's just something that we've all talked about to death in the last 30 or 40 years. But I'm here to tell you guys afresh. I'm here to challenge you afresh. You need to reconsider what you watch on the internet and what you watch on TV. And you don't even have to be watching pornography or whatever. I like that lyric, that line in one of Lecrae's songs where he says, BET tonight is addiction to pornography tomorrow morning. He is absolutely right about that. He's like, dude, if I turn on BET tonight and I'm watching all the booty dancing and everything, tomorrow I'm going to find the temptation to pornography irresistible. Why? Because I've been pondering the path tonight. Because I've been pondering her path of life tonight. And I tell you guys the truth, you need to rethink. If you are really struggling with pornography, if you're really struggling with a temptation to something sexual, you need to reconsider the way that you live. Are there things in your life, and you're like, I can't get free of this, God. Why aren't you helping me? And he's just like, dude, you watch Sex and the City 5 times a week. Duh. You know, it's like, and it doesn't even have to be as overt as that show. I don't even know if that show's even still on. But the point is, it's just a good illustration point. The point is that it's incredible to me. I think it's mind-boggling sometimes to Christian leaders to have Christians just be like, I just can't get free of this. And then you start to talk to them and you find out that they go to 2 or 3, 4 concerts a year, and they're all secular artists. And you're like, really? Are you really surprised that you're having a temptation or a desire to do this thing, and you listen to so-and-so, you know? And I don't want to say any names, whatever, but... I'm surprised, sorry, I'm going to name drop. I am surprised in the last 6 or 7 years how many Christians, young and parents, that I've known who like, for example, John Mayer. And I'm just like, are you serious? Are you serious? He is such a womanizing, like, piece of junk. Like, I was sitting in a dentist's office not that long ago, and I read the Rolling Stone magazine, because it was the only one that was there, and it was their interview of him. Dude, that guy is a scumbag, and his songs are disgusting and despicable, and they are antichrist, those songs. And I am surprised at how many Christians I've known that go to his concert. I know Christians literally that went to his concert and yet are surprised. And I'm talking about Christians who have kids, and they're surprised that their kids walk away from the Lord. And I'm going, but you are letting the enemy into your household. And I know I sound like a Puritan. I'm sorry. I really apologize for that. I'm not preaching legalism, but I am telling you guys something. There are things that you are possibly allowing into your life that are causing you to ponder her path, pondering his path, the path of the adulterous man or the path of the adulterous woman. And if you're finding yourself incapable of overcoming temptation, you need to destroy, you need to get rid of that thing that is taking you in that direction. All right, so I have 1 minute to do. No. That's a good place to stop. Oh, that's at the end of that's the end of point 5, so we're halfway. That's a good place to stop. Father, I thank you for your word. I pray that the things that we're considering tonight, that they would take root in our hearts, Lord, and that you would have your way. I pray for all of us, Lord, that you would give us strength. I think there are probably, just statistically speaking, a number of people in here who are in one way or another struggling in a major way with some form impurity. Lord, I pray if there's something in their life that they won't let go of, or if there's something in their life that they're doing or not doing that is aiding in their downfall, I pray that tonight that you would make it clear to them, that you would speak to their hearts in Jesus' name, that you would give them clarity and that you would give them strength. I pray in Jesus' name that you would let the oppressed go free and that you would break the heavy yokes of bondage. In Jesus' name, amen.